Hello and welcome to this episode of China Edge, brought to you by the SupChina team. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist at Wall Street TV who covers China and its relation to the world. Here at China Edge, we go beyond the headlines and guide you, our audience, through the jungle of Chinese regulations. We go deep into industry trends and identify challenges and opportunities in the Chinese market. Speaker Pelosi arrived in Taiwan on Tuesday night local time. She is expected to meet with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwanese lawmakers, and human rights activists on Wednesday. The visit has drawn considerable outrage from Beijing. The People's Liberation Army said it would stage a series of military drills, including long-range live firing in the Taiwan Strait from Tuesday evening on. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has repeatedly pledged to reunify Taiwan by force if necessary. Will Speaker Pelosi's visit be a watershed moment for cross-strait relations? How will China retaliate? Joining me today is Ms. Bonnie Glaser, Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund. Thank you, Bonnie, for being here with me.
Thank you for having me.
So, Bonnie, can you first help us reconstruct the thinking behind Speaker Pelosi's visit? What are the objectives she hopes to achieve, and does this trip actually help with that?
Well, I haven't talked to Speaker Pelosi personally, but she did publish an article in the Washington Post explaining why she thought it was important to go to Taiwan. Speaker Pelosi supports Taiwan as a democracy. I think she represents the views of many members of Congress who also support Taiwan in its democracy, want to strengthen Taiwan's security as Taiwan faces so much pressure and coercion from the People's Republic of China. Speaker Pelosi has a long history of criticizing China's human rights abuses. Certainly goes back as far as June of 1989, after the Tiananmen massacre, when Speaker Pelosi, 2 years later, flanked by two members of Congress, her colleagues, stood in Tiananmen Square and unfurled a banner supporting the protesters and those who died in that episode in 1989. She was a strong advocate for democracy in Hong Kong as well, and has criticized China's policies in Xinjiang and its internment of the Uyghurs. So the fact that she's a strong advocate of freedom and democracy in Taiwan should come as no surprise to anyone.
Hi, this is Lizzie, host of the China Edge show. We have prepared both English and Chinese subtitles for the show. You can turn on subtitles by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your YouTube video. Click on the gear icon and select from one of the three languages: English, Chinese Simplified, and Chinese Traditional. 大家好，这里是李琦。在 China Edge 节目中，我们为您准备了中英双语字幕，请您按照屏幕上的指示打开齿轮图标，选择需要的语言，然后选择 CC 按钮，打开字幕，这样就可以看到有字幕的节目了。
I think that Taiwan feels particularly under pressure in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Public opinion polls in Taiwan have revealed that the percentage of Taiwanese citizens who say that they're confident that the United States would come to Taiwan's aid if attacked, that percentage has dropped. Some polls show 25 to 30%. It's been a very significant drop. And I think that the DPP, the ruling party, of course, wants to show that their relationship with the United States is very strong. And we have elections coming up, the local elections in Taiwan later this year. And I think that the DPP wants to demonstrate that their policies are correct, that they have managed the relationship with both China and the United States well. So for them, I think having Pelosi carries a lot of positive implications, but there's no doubt that they also see the risks.
Right.
They don't want this to lead to a real deterioration in Taiwan's security.
Right. So I wanted to turn to the coordination or lack of coordination between the executive branch and the legislative branch here. Is there anything to the belief that we hear in some Chinese state media that President Biden actually condoned the trip? Do you think that's something that should have been discussed and clarified during the call between President Biden and President Xi a few days ago?
We know from reading the readouts of the conversation between Xi Jinping and President Biden that Taiwan was discussed, but we don't know whether there was specific discussion about Pelosi's visit, and there may not have been. I think it would have not been really reasonable or logical for Xi Jinping to tell President Biden, I will not tolerate Pelosi going to Taiwan. He could push himself into a corner if he made demands that then President Biden was unable to meet or unwilling to meet. He feels very strongly about now telling a member of Congress what they can and cannot do. But as president, he could have spoken to Pelosi if he chose to. And my understanding is that he opted not to. That should not be interpreted as meaning that he endorsed the visit, that he supported it. It really doesn't tell us anything. But he did not want to insert himself in the middle.
I see. And so I wanted to turn to the U.S.'s policy toward Taiwan in general. President Biden and other administration officials have repeatedly confirmed that there has been no change to the United States policy toward Taiwan. But it seems like the messaging from the U.S. administration, including the president himself, can be at times inconsistent, and that has caused some unease and confusion among Beijing officials. So what's the current state of affairs in terms of U.S. policy toward Taiwan? Is there any sign that the United States might at some point abandon strategic ambiguity?
So I do want to say that I agree that the messaging from the Biden administration has at times been inconsistent on Taiwan. At times it has been confused. There have been moments when there have been actions taken that I believe are inconsistent with a one China policy of the United States. But of course, I just represent the views of one person, so I don't make these decisions. But I would cite as an example, very early on in the Biden administration, the ambassador from the United States to Palau traveled to Taiwan. I believe that was the first time that a sitting ambassador serving in another country went to Taiwan. So that's just one example. We had a recent kerfuffle with the State Department webpage on Taiwan. It was pulled down. The language was changed. They excised the sentence that said the U.S. doesn't support Taiwan independence. And then 3 weeks later, they reinserted the sentence, and the page was basically restored to what it had been previously. Hard to explain why these things are happening. And of course, on top of that, the president himself has said not only that he would come to Taiwan's defense under all circumstances, which as president, he has the prerogative to say, even though it's not U.S. policy. But I think more importantly is that he has said the United States has a commitment to do that. And those of us who study U.S. policy toward Taiwan know that our policy is found in the Taiwan Relations Act, passed in 1979. It obligates the United States to do a few things, such as sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. It does not obligate the United States to come to Taiwan's defense, and yet the president says that. So there is confusion. And I think that Tony Blinken, in his speech, our Secretary of State, and also Secretary of Defense Austin, in his speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, both made an effort to try and clarify and get control of the policy and be more disciplined. We will see whether that holds. But the consequence of this is what's important. China has diminishing confidence that the United States really has a one China policy. And Xi Jinping himself has said there's a gap between the words and deeds of the United States. And he is doubtful whether the United States actually does not support Taiwan independence. And it is against this background that the Pelosi visit is taking place. And that is why it is so dangerous. Finally, I will say that strategic ambiguity is essentially when we broke our defense treaty, bilateral defense treaty with Taiwan in 1979, it was left ambiguous as to whether or not the United States would come to Taiwan's defense. And there is a growing number of experts and congressmen, though not officials in the Biden administration, I think it's important to note that, who are advocating that the United States abandon its policy of strategic ambiguity and adopt a policy of strategic clarity that essentially gives Taiwan an ironclad commitment to defense. And in my view, that is not a good idea. I think it is more likely to provoke an attack from China on Taiwan than it is to deter one.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the answer. It was super helpful. Regardless, it seems at this point we are getting quite dangerously to close to a crisis now, especially after the speaker's visit today, and we see the reactions from Beijing. Are there risks of further escalation, potentially some sort of a military action?
Well, we are in the middle of exercise season in the Taiwan Strait and around southern China and the East and South China Sea. So there's a lot of military activity going on. And in advance of Pelosi's arrival in Taiwan, there were some Chinese jets that flew very close to the median line in the Strait, even crossing it several times. And apparently, Chinese naval ships operated close to the median line as well. So China was sending signals and using its military forces to do so. But so far, at least it did not, the Chinese did not interfere with Nancy Pelosi's plane. They did not put her in danger. They did announce that some Taiwanese agricultural products are now going to be blocked going into China. So they're showing that they have clout in the economic realm, in the military realm, that they can take punitive actions against Taiwan. At this point, I think that they're going to watch what takes place with Nancy Pelosi's visit. How public are her engagements going to be? Is she going to have a press briefing? What is she going to say about U.S. policy toward Taiwan? And perhaps if Nancy Pelosi is somewhat restrained, maybe China's reaction will be somewhat restrained as well. But my expectation is this is not a 24-hour incident, that we will see China react over a period of days and weeks and maybe months, depending on the judgments they draw from this visit about U.S. intentions and about President Tsai Ing-wen's policies.
Right. And I wanted to turn to domestic politics a little bit. How does it all relate to Xi Jinping's personal legacy and the Chinese domestic politics, especially in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress?
Well, this is a hotly debated topic. My own view is that we don't really know for sure whether unification with Taiwan is a legacy issue for Xi Jinping. That is, that during his time in office, that he wants to achieve reunification. And since now we don't know how much longer he's going to be in power, that becomes even more uncertain. Most people think he will secure another 5 years this fall. Many people think he will be in power for another 10 or 15 years, and some even think he will be there for life. But Xi Jinping has said one important statement. He has said it twice. And it was first said at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. He said reunification is a necessary requirement for the achievement of national rejuvenation. And of course, the target date for that goal is the middle of this century. And it's the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So many people think, okay, well, that might be his goal, but he's not going to be in power in 2049. So really, what does he want to achieve? My belief has long been that China's top priority is to prevent Taiwan from going into independent. And if China loses confidence that it can prevent that, it might use force against Taiwan. That is what the most dangerous scenario is. But the concern in, I think, the United States and among China watchers is that Xi Jinping wants to advance and promote reunification and might, as I said, want to really make progress and even achieve unification in his term in office. If that proves to be the case, then we are in uncharted waters. And things could get very dangerous. There have been news reports about potential deadlines and timelines, maybe that Xi Jinping wants to reunify the country by 2027. More recently, there was a New York Times report that said that China might move on Taiwan in 18 months. I'm still waiting to see the evidence for this. I'm not convinced, but I think we all have to watch this very closely. But finally, I'll say this is a very interactive process. China's policies are to some extent determined by, as you said in your question, what is in Xi Jinping's mind, his ambition, his legacy, what he wants to achieve. But it's also a function of US policy and Taiwan's policy. So I continue to believe that if the United States is pursuing a consistent, constructive one China policy, and Taiwan is also seeking to preserve the status quo, which I believe that Tsai Ing-wen has been pursuing a policy of preserving the status quo, then I think that the risk of China deciding it needs to use force to reunify the country is greatly less. So that's what I hope the scenario will be going forward.
Right. So speaking of that risk premium balance, what's your advice to the U.S. administration on how to support Taiwan, both militarily and economically, without risking escalating the situation to a full-scale war? Is there a better way to conduct the United States Taiwan policy?
Well, I am in favor of selling arms to Taiwan. I think that we have to make sure that Xi Jinping wakes up every morning and says, today is not the day to invade Taiwan because the cost is too high. And the cost is one that is created not just by U.S. military capability, but Taiwan's ability to defend itself. If Taiwan is an easy melon to pick, then Xi Jinping might decide that he should just go ahead and use force. So Taiwan has work to do itself. In addition to procuring the right weapons, it needs to revamp its reserve force, make that more effective. And I think that it would benefit from learning lessons from Ukraine and the resistance that the Ukrainians put up when Russia invaded. Taiwan could build something like a territorial defense force, which it could learn lessons from Finland and Sweden and the Baltic states, all of which have training for civilians in things like military first aid, as well as basic ability to shoot rifles and to defend their neighborhoods. So this is something that I support, and I think that the United States could help Taiwan to do that. Politically, I think we have to have a more consistent set of policies. We can't say one thing and do something else. We can't have a one China policy that, as Beijing says, is hollowing out. We do have to have consistency. We have to have credibility for a statement that says we don't support Taiwan independence. And I think that we should try to implement things that will contribute to strengthening deterrence and avoid doing things that will simply provoke Beijing and not add to deterrence. So some things that are purely symbolic, perhaps we should set aside and really focus on what will prevent war and what will actually strengthen Taiwan's security.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.